we want this to be a place where no matter where you are, you're meeting with the Lord today. And that's really my hope. And I'm going to do my best through what's a little bit of a different strategy in a sermon today to try to bring us at the feet of Jesus. So I'm going to start with a nice, happy Christmas verse. So we're going to go Matthew chapter 2, verse 16. Verse 16. And I'm going to read one verse, and then I'm going to give a bit of a story here as we open up this verse. So this is Matthew 2:16. We're going to stand later, but I just want you to hear this at first. Then Herod, when he saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, became furious, and he sent and killed all the male children in Bethlehem, in all that region, who were 2 years old or under, according to the time that he had ascertained from the wise men. Merry Christmas. Right? Like, nothing says Merry Christmas like some babies being killed. And yet this is how the Christmas story begins in a lot of ways. And so my hope today is I want us to ask a couple of interesting questions. I want to ask a harder question, like what makes someone good or bad? And where does that come from? We're going to look at Herod today. We're going to look at the wise men. Like, why do different people have different reactions to the birth of Jesus? And ultimately, where does that come from? And then how are we reacting? Right? How am I today reacting to the birth of Jesus? Because ultimately, this entire Christmas season and our whole faith is predicated on this one person, Jesus. So how am I responding to him, especially this Christmas season? How am I responding to Jesus? But we're going to start looking at this story of Herod. And I need to say this up front, that as I tell this story that I'm going to tell you, it's a story that you likely have never heard before, and I need you to listen all the way through. If you have to get up and leave for whatever reason and you don't hear the second half of what I'm going to say, you're going to think I'm a heretic, and you're going to think that this church is crazy. So you just got to follow through all the way. And I know that that's true mentally too. You can leave mentally. So if you leave for a little while mentally, make sure you come back, and if you miss something, ask a question. Right? I know that because I read stories to my kids at night sometimes. And I'm always fully present. No, just joking. So let's look at this story of Herod. It's a story that begins 60 years before Jesus is born. And Herod is born in a very unique time period in history. He's born not only into a unique time, but a unique family. Right? He's born in the beginnings of what will be a civil war in a smaller town where he would have known a lot of people, into a family that was mixed. His dad was a Jew, his mom was an Arab, right? And so he grew up as an outsider. He was rejected from a very young age. Like he had a different dialect, he looked different, he spoke a little bit different, his food was a little bit different, and from a very young age, in elementary school and junior high, he was always a bit of an outsider, which, as many of us know through our own experience, like that's hard. When you don't fit in, that's not easy. You think about Herod's life as he continued to grow up. His dad was a political leader, which came with a lot of strife, which came with a target on his family's back. And his dad isn't what you would call necessarily like a good dad. In his growing up, his dad was abusive to his mom. His dad was abusive to his siblings, very likely abusive to Herod himself. And so he grew up in a lot of ways with what most of us would call trauma. He grew up experiencing, as he got older, a lot of the hardships and realities of war. By the time he was about 10 years old, there was a full-on civil war in his town that came along with the presence of an Arabian army that came in and ultimately killed a bunch of his political adversaries from his family. And he just saw and felt like the pressure of what this brought in terms of destruction and just the heinous reality of war. But as this Arabian army came in, he also began to build a little bit of a soft spot for Rome, because Rome came in, and ultimately they brought peace to a city that he loved, because Rome came in with their power and their influence, and they brought peace. And it was hard because they killed 12,000 of his political adversaries, but they brought peace for a while. So things were good in the city, kind of during his teens and 20s. He had like physical rest, but again, life at home was not easy. Life at home was really hard. To make matters worse, when he was about 30, his dad was assassinated by a political rival. But as you can imagine, like that created a lot of mixed feelings in him. Like, what do you do when your dad's no longer here? Your dad that kind of protected the family through whatever means possible, yet your dad who was also abusive, right? And so it's in some ways, I'm really happy that my dad's dead. And in some ways, like, I'm devastated. And now what do I do with these feelings? A lot of mixed feelings. To make matters worse, 3 years later, even though Rome was bringing some semblance of peace, a new army comes in and starts a war in your city. This new war, as you can imagine, came with all the accoutrements of war, if you will, comes with, killing your king, comes with putting in their own government, comes with, the slaughtering of your friends, the taking of your women, the indoctrination of your children. And in the middle of this, he was able to escape. He was able to escape and go to the place that he thought would bring freedom to his people. He was able to escape and make his way up to Rome. And while he went to Rome, he went to an emperor there and he said, hey, this place that I love is being tormented. It's in turmoil. We're having a really hard time. Would you help support me in giving me an army to go back and to bring peace to this land that I love, even though it's a land that has a mixed love from me? And that's what he does, right? The emperor gives him an army and he goes back and he does what he has to do to bring peace to a very tumultuous place. With that comes all kinds of baggage and hardship. He sets up with Rome in Israel, in Jerusalem, a new kingdom. He kicks out that foreign invading army, and he sets up a new time of peace, right? Carrying on what the Romans called Pax Romana. He's trying to bring this kind of season of peace, and it's not easy. Right? How do you bring peace to a people who are religiously divided? There's 4 different factions of religious Jews here, and there's a lot of infighting, and he experienced this his whole life. And so over the next 35 years as he reigned as king, he had to make a lot of really hard decisions with a really hard upbringing. One of the decisions he had to make was to eliminate one of the high priests. Right? That's a really hard decision to make. He had to eliminate one of his own wives, right, who was a threat to his family. He had to eliminate a number of his uncles. Right? And then the hardest decision that he ever had to make was one that we started this sermon with. He had to eliminate some 20, 30, 40 young boys under the age of 2, because if he didn't, there would be unrest and peace would not be a thing in the city that he loved. Now, let me ask you a question. Is Herod a good guy or a bad guy? Right? Should he be held responsible for all the terrible things that he did, even though he had a horrible upbringing? And wouldn't anyone with the life that he had make the decisions that he made? Right? Should he be responsible for this? And if so, why? Right? Maybe he had mental health issues. Maybe he had a predisposition towards, being erratic and irrational. Why should he be held responsible for these actions? Put yourself in his shoes, right? I'm trying to do my best. If I was in those shoes, what would I do? Now, the story that I just told you, I completely made up. It's not real at all. Other than every fact in that story is pretty much real, none of the motives that I know of are real. I made up every single one of those motives. I just made the whole thing up. But every fact, like where he was born, the family he was born into, all the things that happened actually happened. But we don't know why. But we live in this really interesting time where what we have heard is we have heard over and over and over these backstories to these villains to help us humanize them, right? To help us to think, well, maybe they're not that bad, and maybe the decisions that they're making aren't really theirs. Maybe it's just a byproduct of the environment that they were living in and the family that they were raised in, and maybe we should just have sympathy for them as a person. right? You think about some of the different stories that we're hearing in Hollywood right now. What's the big one right now, right? It just came out in the theaters. Wicked, right? You have a story of someone who's a witch who grew up, who was, people did not like her. They were prejudiced against her, and that kind of shaped who she was, right? You think about some of these other stories, the Joker, right? Neglect, mental health issues. Like, we should feel bad for him, shouldn't we? Right? You think of, JJ's not here, which makes me sad. You think of old Anakin Skywalker, right? Why does Anakin Skywalker become Darth Vader? And wouldn't anyone become Darth Vader in Anakin Skywalker's story, right? You have someone who loved his mom, who was taken away from his mom, the only relationship that he really had, to train as a Jedi on his own. He's not allowed to marry the woman that he loves. Like, that's harsh. Of course anyone would turn into the type of person who Darth Vader was, right? How about the Grinch, right? The Jim Carrey version, right? He's harsh and cruel towards all the people of Whoville. Why? Because he was bullied as a kid. Because the woman that he loved as a child, rejected him. Of course you're going to turn out that way. Is it actually his fault? Right? You think about this interesting story right now. And by interesting, I mean terrible. Brian Johnson was the CEO of this United Healthcare Insurance Corporation. He was killed, plain as day. And people are having sympathy with the murderer. Like, he currently has a GoFundMe of somewhere over $100,000 right now because people are saying, well, you killed someone who really is a horrible person because people are being rejected for their healthcare stuff, and maybe you're not that bad anyways. Well, who's to say what is bad? Right? Who's to say what's good? Right? We live in this really interesting time where if we're not careful, the story that we can hear, you have heard, is that everything is subjective, right? That everything is relative, that maybe we should have sympathy and not feel bad for people like Herod because maybe he just grew up in a home that was awful, right? Maybe it's all relative. I was talking to a friend of mine the other day. He's got a young daughter, and he was watching an animal show with his daughter, and it's the moment where the lion eats the baby gazelle. And his daughter was just like, that's so sad, that's evil, that's horrible, like, I love animals. And my friend says, no, it's not evil, it's not wrong, it just is. That's just life. And a lot of people, if we're not careful, will take that same mentality and they'll just place it on humanity. Right? Herod isn't evil, he just is. The Grinch just is. Like, that's just how you would respond if you were born into this environment. It just is. But is that actually true? And is that the world that we would fully want? And how do we know what's true? Right, today in the birth story of Jesus, I'm going to do my best to look at two different groups of people. Both looking, I believe, both experiencing what is true and having different reactions to it. So we're going to start with the wise men, and we're going to look at what happened to the wise men and why did they respond to Jesus the way that he did, or the way that they did. And then we're going to look at Herod as well, and we're going to ask the bigger question of, man, what makes something good, and how are we responding to Jesus? So if you could, would you stand with me? We're going to go Matthew chapter 2. We're going to read the whole opening phrase. We read it earlier. I'm going to read it again. And we're going to see a group of people looking for answers to life's big questions about how do we know what we know? Is there truth that we can stand on that isn't just relative? Here we go. This is Matthew chapter 2, verse 1. When I'm done, I'm going to say, this is the word of the Lord, and you can say, thanks be to God. Now, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose, and we have come to worship him. When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And assembling all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. They told him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for so it is written by the prophet, and you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For from you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. Then Herod summoned the wise men secretly and ascertained from them what time the star had appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, "Go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word that I too may come and worship him." After listening to the king, they went on their way, and behold, the star that they had seen when it rose went before them until it came to rest over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. And going into the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they fell down and worshiped him. Then, opening their treasures, they offered him gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. You can grab a seat. Now, as we look at this first group of people who have this encounter with Jesus, like the story of Herod, we know some things, but we do have a lot of questions. We don't know everything about the wise men. The questions that we have, come along the lines of like, well, who were they? Where did they come from? Why are they looking for Jesus? How many of them were there? There's a lot of questions that we just don't know the exact answers to, but we do know some things. We know that wise men were the social elites, right? So as opposed to kind of your late elementary school shepherd, like kind of social, I wouldn't say social outcasts, but just kind of fringe of society people, to like the bougie, high life, high society people. Like these are your professors, your think tanks. These are like the religious elites all wrapped together in one. These people are looking for this so-called king of the Jews, and we know that they're not Jews, right? They do not worship Yahweh. They don't worship God, but they are really interested to try to figure out who this person is. Most people assume that there's somewhere around 40 to 60 who traveled in a kind of a caravan together. Most people assume that they came from around Babylon, which is 800 miles away, right? So back in the day, they say, the average camel rate, something like 20 miles a day. So you're talking 40 days of travel. This is significantly inconvenient. Like we are going way out of our way. And yet they're really excited about this, right? The text, it talks about the language in there is just like overjoyed. Like the elites are like, I cannot wait to meet this child. And when they do, when they finally meet him, the text says this in verse 11. And they go into the house, and they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they fell down, and they worshiped him. Why would a group of elites from 800 miles away come and fall down at the feet of a 2-year-old and worship him? That's a really good question. Seriously, why would you do that? Like, it's hard enough for us today to fall down on our feet. Like, most of us are kind of like, that feels awkward. I'll kind of lift my hands maybe or sing in my head. And most of us know and love Jesus. And yet here's a group of people who don't follow Yahweh, who fall on their face to worship a 2-year-old. Why? Why? Genuinely, why do they do that? I believe that they did that because when they met Jesus, they met someone that they've been waiting for a long time. I believe when they met Jesus, they met someone who had truth that they could stand on that was not relative. Right? These are people who are looking for truth. These are people who are searching for it with everything that they have. I believe when they meet Jesus, they meet someone who, when they are in the presence of, they realize the only thing I can do is fall on my face. I believe when they meet Jesus, they meet someone who they were looking for, who was not just from this world, and they knew it. Now, why do I think that? Because the Bible doesn't exactly say why. Right? So we got to connect a few dots here. We got to connect the dots of why were these people most likely from Babylon? Why were they looking for someone who was Jewish? Because they weren't. Why did they care? In order to kind of connect a few dots, I want to go to the book of Daniel. If you got a Bible, let's go Daniel chapter 2. And let's go to when Israel and Babylon had close relations with one another. It wasn't exactly a friendly relationship, but it was a relationship nonetheless. The relationship between Babylon and Israel started about 600 years prior to when these wise men met Jesus. It started with Babylon asserting all of their power, all of their force over Israel, not in a militaristic way yet, in complete dominance, but in a, we're going to establish our authority over you by indoctrinating you with our leaders. We're going to kind of put in a puppet king, and we are going to take all of your elites, and we are going to brainwash your children into thinking and believing the way that we do. And they did that by literally taking a bunch of the kids. Babylon took a group of kids, and one of them had the name Daniel. Daniel was gifted by God. He could interpret dreams from people. And the king, Nebuchadnezzar, he had all these wild dreams, and no one in the land could interpret them, yet this kind of 18-year-old Daniel, he could interpret them. And I want to look at this interaction between the king of Babylon and this dream that he has and this interpretation of this dream from Daniel. And I promise you it'll come back together if I do my job well. So this is Daniel chapter 2, starting in verse 31. This is Daniel describing the dream that Nebuchadnezzar has. It says, "You saw, O king, and behold, a great image." This is Daniel saying, this is the dream that you had. This image, mighty and exceeding brightness, and of exceeding brightness, stood before you, and its appearance was frightening. The head of this image was of fine gold, its chest and arms of silver, its middle and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partially of iron and partially of clay. So he says there's this giant statue, and this statue was kind of marked by 4 different stuff that it was made up of, and that's the image that he sees. As you looked, a stone was cut out by no human hand, and it struck the image. So this stone comes and it strikes the image on its feet of iron and clay and broke them to pieces. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold all together were broken in pieces and became like the chaff of the summer threshing floors, and the wind carried them away so that not a trace of them could be found. So the statue that you saw in your dream, a rock hit it, the entire thing crumbled, all the pieces of the statue are blown away. But the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. So that's the dream that he has, right? So the king, he doesn't tell him what the dream is. Daniel says, this is the dream that you had. And the king says, yeah, you're right. That is the dream. And now here's the interpretation of this dream in verse 36. This was the dream. Now we will tell the king its interpretation. You, O king, the king of kings, to whom the God of heaven has given the kingdom, the power, the might, and the glory, and into whose hand he has given, wherever they dwell, the children of men, the beasts of the field, and the birds of the heaven, making you rule over all of them. You are the head of gold. So again, you got an 18, 19-year-old, he's speaking to the king, and he's saying, God of heaven has given you all authority on earth. You rule the largest army on the earth. You have power. You have authority. In your dream, in this statue, you are the golden head. But verse 39 says, but another kingdom inferior to you shall arise after you, and yet a third kingdom of bronze, which shall rule over all the earth. And there shall be a fourth kingdom, strong as iron, because iron breaks to pieces and shatters all things, and like iron that crushes, it shall break and crush all these. So he says, hey, there's going to come 4 kingdoms, and each one's going to destroy the one above it. And as history unfolds, Babylon gets conquered. They get conquered by the Persians. That's that next kingdom. And then another kingdom comes after Babylon, come the Greeks. After the Greeks come that final kingdom, that kingdom of Rome. And so here you have, in Babylon, these wise men, they know the story, they know the history, and they're waiting for this final prediction that Daniel gives starting in verse 44. And in the days of those kings, right, in the days of Rome, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed. So it says, there's another kingdom that's coming. It shall never be destroyed, nor shall the kingdom be left to another people. It shall break in pieces all these kingdoms and bring them to an end, and it shall stand forever. Just as you saw that a stone was cut from a mountain by no human hand, and that it broke into pieces the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold. A great God has made known to the king what shall be after this. The dream is certain and its interpretation sure. I promise you, this is what the wise men were searching for. They were searching for this stone that's going to rise up and that's going to be not from earth, but from heaven, and that will establish a kingdom that's right, that's true, that's sure, that will last forever, and it won't be the wisdom of men, it will be the wisdom and power of God. Like, what else would cause you to go 800 miles to fall on your face to worship a 2-year-old, right? When you have everything. Like, there's only a wisdom and power that comes from God that would put you on your face to go, hey, I want to worship you. Like, I don't know everything about your God, and I come from a faraway place, but I've watched this story that I was told for hundreds of years, and it came to pass. Like, after Nebuchadnezzar came a kingdom, and now this thing that we're waiting for, I think it's here. And I think when they met Jesus, they experienced that kingdom that wasn't from this earth, that gives us an authority that's not from this earth, that says not everything is relative, there are absolutes, there is truth that comes from outside. And that's what they got to experience in the worshiping of Jesus. But not everyone responded to Jesus the same way. Right? Not all of us do. Some of us respond like Herod. How did Herod respond? He was threatened by Jesus. We see this immediately, that he was concerned. He was troubled. Verse 3 says he was troubled and all Jerusalem with him. Why was he troubled? I think he was troubled. Give him the greatest benefit of the doubt, which I think is absolute garbage. And you say he was troubled because he just wanted peace in his land and he cared about his people. Maybe that's true. Maybe his history, maybe whatever. Like, I think he was heinous and horrible, and I think he wanted all the power to himself. Right? And the fact of the matter is, a lot of us want the power to ourselves. We don't want to have an authority over us. But the question is, as we see the story unfold, Herod then responds by having all these babies killed, because he doesn't want that authority over him. And then back to the very beginning, is Herod a good guy or is he a bad guy? Despite his motives, right? Despite any reason why he might have done what he did, our culture wants to say, well, maybe it's not that bad, right? Maybe what he did isn't that bad. Maybe Darth Vader isn't that bad. Maybe we should sympathize with him, right? Maybe he's not actually, in fact, that bad. Maybe we're not that bad. Maybe the reason that we do the things that we do is just because we had a rough childhood. No one ever told me the truth. Why should I be held responsible for this? Right? The fact of the matter is, Herod did have a choice. He didn't have to kill these babies, and despite his motives, killing babies is wrong, simply because people are made in the image of God. Right? And that truth comes from a truth that's outside of this world. That truth comes from a kingdom that is outside of this world. When Jesus came, he brings a truth that supersedes all cultures, all kingdoms, all times. And when we break those rules, punishment is due. So you look at the life of Herod. At some point, Herod's going to be held responsible for his actions. At some point, you and I are going to be held responsible for our actions. At some point, whether it's Jim Carrey or Darth Vader or whoever, we're going to be held responsible for our actions despite the story that we came from. Now, in some ways, that doesn't feel super fair, does it? Right? Some of us had a great upbringing and a great history. How does that seem fair, that I'm going to be held responsible for this when I had an abusive father and a horrible upbringing? Here's the part that I think is almost not fair. Jesus comes to forgive anyone who would ask for it. Like, how beautiful is that? Like, that's the part that's almost unfair. You're like, wait a second. We're all held responsible, rightly so, for decisions that we make, and yet someone else is going to take my punishment for me? Right? So at the end of the day, as we look at the cradle, what the cradle is Jesus coming to earth saying, yes, you know what? In fact, there's no one in here who's a good guy. Like, sorry. Like, whether you're Herod, whether you're Laura Gannon, probably the most lovely woman I know, other than my wife. Yeah. Meaning like a wonderful person. Like we're broken. Like we're sinful. And we have an eternity separated from God because of it, because we have done what we ought not to. And yet the cradle says God came to earth because of that, because of our sin, and he's going to pay for it. How beautiful is that? Right now, our question is just going to be, how do we respond? Right? How do we initially respond? Am I going to give my life to that? Am I going to recognize that? And how am I going to ongoing respond? Right? This week, this month, next month, how am I going to respond? I'll tell you what. Here's how I want us to respond. I want us to respond with the joy of the wise men. Right? Who they know. When you're in the presence of Jesus, you know, hey, I'm nothing. And yet I'm loved. Like I am loved with an unbelievably unconditional love that says it does not matter what my past is. In fact, it's my past or my sin today that brought Jesus here. Right? So I don't need to walk into church with like the shame and the guilt and the sorrow of what I know, but what the person sitting next to me doesn't know. I don't have to carry that because the cross says that's why he came. And I get to have a huge amount of joy. Or I can be like Herod and say, I'm going to live my life, and maybe I'm not that bad of a guy because I had a rough upbringing. But the invitation is to follow Jesus for who he is, because if we don't, I believe Herod someday will hear the words from Daniel that in those days the kings, the God of heaven, will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed. Nor shall the kingdom be left to another people. It shall break in pieces all these kingdoms and bring them to an end, and it shall stand forever. And listen to these last words that Daniel says. This dream is certain, and its interpretation is sure. I'm going to lead us in some prayer and reflection to this. Lord, oh man, we hear the message all the time that the things that we do, they're not really good and they're not really bad, and it's all relative and it's subjective. And if God doesn't exist, that is a true statement. If God does not exist, and there is not a wisdom that comes from without, that comes from out of this world, everything is relative and subjective. And we shouldn't feel bad for the Herods, and we shouldn't feel bad for the Darth Vaders, and we shouldn't feel bad for us who do things that are awful. Yet if you do exist, and you come from without, and you set a standard that says, no. There is right and there is wrong, and I know you're not going to do it all right, and so I'm going to pay for your rebellion. And I did that sending Jesus to earth. God, I pray that we would walk in that freedom knowing that. God, if there's anyone here this morning who doesn't know that and who's just like, I'm just trying to live my life, I pray that they would come face to face with that cradle. God, the cradle that says, I see you, I know your rebellion, and I know what you owe, and I'm going to pay it for you. And that we just have the freedom to walk in that. God, if there's anyone in here this morning who has recognized that already and yet is carrying shame or guilt, God, I pray that we'd be able to just let that go. And in Christmas say, thank you for this insane gift. God, that I don't need to pretend anymore that I've got everything figured out and my life's all nice. God, but that I can recognize, like, I've received this gift of forgiveness, and that I can walk in joy, that I would choose joy. Thank you, Lord.